The train doors opened to a sound the women had never heard before, dry wind sweeping across endless plains, and for thousands of miles they had crossed oceans and rails under guard, first in silence, then in disbelief, and finally in a kind of numb surrender. But nothing prepared them for the desolate warmth of Texas, a land so wide the horizon itself seemed to tremble in the heat, because it was September 1944, and the Second World War was still tearing Europe apart. Yet here in the American Southwest, the front lines felt like another planet, the air holding the scent of dust, mesquite, and distant cattle herds. And among the 200 German women stepping off the train, many of them nurses, auxiliaries, and civilian workers swept up by Allied arrests in France. One of them, Lilette Weber, just 23 years old and the daughter of a Munich carpenter, paused at the foot of the wooden steps and let her boots hit the Texas ground for the first time, sinking slightly into a crust of ochre soil, and she squinted toward the sun, that glaring white disk that seemed ready to burn straight through her eyelids, while around her the women murmured quietly, "It's so heiß. It's so hot. Where are we? What is this place?" And a U.S. Army sergeant pointed them toward a line of military trucks, his tone firm but not cruel, saying, "Welcome to Camp Hearn, Texas. Move along. Ladies, stay in formation." Because Camp Hearn was one of more than 40 major POW camps scattered across the United States, most of them holding German soldiers captured in North Africa or France. But the chaos of war had swept some German women into this system: 2 Army nurses, Red Cross workers, clerks from abandoned headquarters, and for the Americans, they were simply another category to manage. While for the women themselves this was exile. And as the trucks rumbled away from the rail siding, Lilette watched miles of open ranchland flow past, sun-soaked fields, distant windmills, fences stretching into eternity, and she felt weightless, suspended between worlds, the Europe she had lost and this strange land of dust and sky. And beside her sat Annalise, a timid 19-year-old who had served as a field hospital assistant near Cannes, clutching her bag as if it might float away, whispering, "Do you think they will put us to work?" And Lilette answered softly, "Yes, I think that's the point," not knowing how right she was, because when the convoy approached the outskirts of Camp Hearn, the women saw rows of low wooden barracks neatly spaced behind fences topped with barbed wire, guard towers rising at each corner, and an actual cowboy on horseback watching the convoy pass with his hat tilted low, his horse shifting lazily beneath him, and the strangeness of it was overwhelming. Yet inside the camp the atmosphere surprised them even more, because the guards were disciplined but polite, distributing water canteens, escorting the women to assigned barracks that were neat and clean, and though the fences loomed overhead, the camp carried an unexpected air of routine rather than fear, and for Lilette kindness in captivity was always unsettling. So that evening, after intake processing, when she stepped outside into the cooling air and the Texas sky had deepened to a dark crystalline blue with stars appearing one by one like scattered lanterns, she heard voices drifting from nearby barracks, women laughing nervously at their first American meal, others writing letters that would take months to reach home, and from beyond the fence came different sounds: the gentle lowing of cattle, the rhythmic creak of a windmill pumping water, and faint guitar music drifting from ranch houses bordering the camp. Music unlike anything she had heard on German radios, slow and wandering, touched with melancholy and dust, and the song rose and fell with the wind as though the plains themselves were singing, and Lilette found herself standing still and listening, not knowing that this music would shape her future more than any uniformed guard or barbed wire fence, because Texas was not Europe, and life here, despite the war, did not follow the rules she knew. And within weeks American ranchers would begin requesting volunteer labor from the camp, because cotton fields needed hands and cattle drives needed cooks, and the Army approved it, because supervised work was better than idleness. And that is how the unimaginable would begin: POWs and cowboys side by side, German women and American ranch families sharing wagons and tools and long hours under the same sun. And Lilette Weber volunteered for these work details partly out of necessity and partly out of restlessness, because she preferred hard work to sitting in a barracks thinking about Munich under fire. And the first day outside the camp the landscape stunned her again, with dry grasslands stretching like a faded quilt beneath a wide blue sky. windmills standing in the distance, hawks circling above, nothing in Germany resembling any of it. And the women rode in a flatbed farm truck guarded by two calm but watchful MPs. And as they approached a cattle gate, they saw local ranchers waiting. Hats pulled low, shirts sun-bleached, hands scarred by work, and the first meetings were awkward, German accents colliding with Texan drawls, smiles hesitant and gazes cautious. But in the world of cattle and cotton, work was a universal language, and Lilat shoveled grain beside a rancher's wife named Martha Caldwell, a sturdy woman with silver hair coiled under a kerchief, who noticed Lilat struggling with the dust and said gently, "You'll get used to it. Texas dust gets in your bones." And Lilat managed a small smile and replied, "I think it already has." And by noon, when the wind kicked up carrying sand and the smell of sagebrush, the ranchers offered water, shade, and lunch-thick sandwiches, peaches from jars, iced tea so cold the jars sweated in the heat, and though prisoners and civilians sat apart and supervised, by the second week greetings grew warmer, by the third conversations began, brief and cautious but human, and by the fourth the women realized something extraordinary. Not one local treated them with hatred, because to Texans the war was far away while neighbors, anyone working on their land, were close. And inside the barracks each evening the women waited for letters from home, long delayed, censored, often heartbreaking, with one letter to Annalise describing bombed neighborhoods in Hamburg, and another telling a woman named Clara that her brother was missing on the Eastern Front, and Lilat received news that her father's workshop had burned, because firestorms had no mercy even for carpenters, and some women cried quietly into their blankets while others stared at the ceiling, hollowed by worry, and the guards knew not to interrupt, because in those moments Texas felt impossibly safe, almost shamefully so, a place where cattle slept peacefully while entire German cities burned in the night. Yet this contrast war in Europe. Peace in America became the strange bridge between the prisoners and the Texans, who saw in these women's suffering not enemies but daughters and sisters far from home. And then one afternoon in April 1945, while sorting equipment under a barn awning, Lilat saw a cowboy approach, tall, sun-weathered, perhaps 25 years old, a rope hanging from his shoulder, his boots marked with dried mud, and he removed his hat politely and said, "Afternoon, ma'am. I'm Caleb Turner. My folks run the North Pasture. You're working up here today." And when Lilat replied that they were cleaning and repairing the feed bins, he said, "You're doing fine work. My ma appreciates it." His eyes holding a kind sincerity she had not seen since leaving home, and she struggled to find the English words to say simply, "Thank you. We try." And Caleb tipped his hat and returned to his horse, an interaction of mere seconds that lingered in her mind all night, because a cowboy had spoken gently to a German prisoner, and the war had never felt so far away, and by summer something subtle had shifted so that the prisoners were no longer novelties but familiar faces. Lilat, who worked hard and said little, Annalise, who laughed nervously but sang in a beautiful voice, Clara, who had learned to braid rope better than some ranch hands, and the Texans had changed too, because war news from Europe, Hitler's suicide, the surrender in May, reached them with relief rather than vengeance, and the women were now prisoners from a defeated nation. But defeat did not look like hatred. It looked like tiredness and loss. It looked like young women waiting for ships that would someday return them to a home in ruins. And for many Texans, hospitality was a reflex, not a choice. If a stranger was hungry, you fed them. If someone worked on your land, you thanked them. And if they were suffering, you offered comfort. And these small acts, innocent and humane, were the seeds of what would grow between these two people standing on either side of a fence. And then came the Texas summer, arriving not with a gradual warming but with a sudden, unforgiving blaze. And by June 1945 the fields shimmered in heat, fence posts cracked in the sun, and the air buzzed with cicadas that seemed to echo across the plains like distant engines. And for the German women at Camp Hearn it was a season of contradictions, because the war in Europe had ended, yet they remained prisoners. Victory had been declared, yet home felt further away than ever, and camp officers explained the delay as administrative processing, that surrender had not magically produced ships nor cleared the seas of mines. So repatriation would take months, perhaps a year, and until then life continued under the same fences and the same rules. But something in Lilat had begun to change, because she had grown used to the sound of American boots on gravel and the drawl of Texan speech and the rhythm of ranch work, her English improving quickly, and she carried herself with a calm presence that ranch families respected. And then there was Caleb Turner, who appeared without warning, always quietly, always at the edge of her vision, checking fences, repairing barn doors, tightening ropes, never intruding, never approaching without cause. Yet it was always clear when he was nearby, because he moved with a kind of deliberate steadiness, as though nothing, not war, not heat, not the vastness of the plains could hurry him. And one morning in late June, Lilet worked alone inside a ramshackle tool shed on the Turner Ranch, mending worn canvas sacks. When Caleb stepped in holding a bucket of nails and said gently, "Morning, hope the heat ain't too rough on you." And she replied, "It is different from Germany." And he chuckled softly, saying, "Different from anywhere, I'd wager." And when she glanced at the bucket and said, "More repairs always," he answered, "The land don't stop for war." And then he hesitated, as though choosing his words carefully before saying, "You do good work. My ma says you're quicker with a needle than most cow hands with a knife." And Lilet felt a faint flush rise in her cheeks, because praise from a cowboy was not given lightly. And she said, "I learned to sew from my father. He made furniture, upholstery too." And Caleb nodded, saying, "A craftsman, then I reckon you take after him." But she didn't answer, because her father's shop, reduced to ash by Allied bombers, was a memory that struck like shrapnel, and Caleb seemed to sense the shift, removing his hat and holding it against his chest, saying quietly, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to stir something painful." And she whispered, "You did not know." And a silence settled between them, not awkward, not heavy, but respectful, a kind of silence that acknowledges loss, until the guard called for her to move on. And before leaving, Caleb said something simple and unexpected. "If you ever need a rest from work, our porch has shade. You can sit a minute before heading back. Just ask the guard." And it was a small offer, a human one, but in the life of a prisoner, humanity was rare enough to feel like treasure. And in the weeks that followed, Lilet found herself speaking more often with Caleb, never alone, never unsupervised, never in a way that broke the official rules, but enough to fill the long Texas days with something she had not felt in years: presence, attention, a sense of being seen. And Caleb asked about Germany, not with judgment, but with genuine curiosity. What was Munich like before all this? What did you do before the war took it all? And she told him about narrow cobblestone streets and wooden toys in shop windows and the church bells that framed her childhood. She spoke of winters so cold the Isar River froze, and summer festivals and evenings when her father carved wood while her mother read by lamplight. And Caleb listened intently, as though carving each detail into his memory. And in return he told her about Texas, its storms, its long drought years, the nights when coyotes howled so close to the ranch house that his mother locked the doors twice. He spoke of cattle drives lasting 10 days and dancing at the county fair, and his brother who had served in Italy and returned with eyes that seemed older than his years. And their stories were different, yet strangely parallel, two lives shaped by war in ways neither had asked for. And one afternoon, after hours repairing torn feed sacks, when the guard allowed the labor crew a few minutes of rest before the truck returned them to camp, Lilet found herself drifting almost unconsciously toward the Turner porch, where Caleb was there drinking water from a tin cup. And he rose when he saw her approach, because Texans were raised that way. And he said, "You look worn clean through." And she replied truthfully, "I am." And he motioned to a wooden chair, saying, "Sit, the sun can't reach you here." And they spoke quietly about the weather, about work, about nothing and everything. Until, without intention, Caleb asked the question that would change everything. "What will you do when they send you home?" And Lilet opened her mouth, but no words came, because Germany was rubble and her father's shop was gone and her family scattered and the future was a void. And she whispered, "I do not know. Germany feels like a ghost, but I do not belong here." And Caleb studied her face carefully, his expression softening, and after a long pause said, "Well, if you ever find yourself with nowhere to go, Texas has a way of making room." And it was not a proposal and not a declaration, but it was something real, an opening, a possibility, a future not defined by war. And as the truck arrived to return the women to camp, Lilet realized something she had not allowed herself to feel in years: hope not for survival, but for life. And then one afternoon in early August, while working beside Caleb near the feed bins, News reached the ranch from a dusty mail truck bouncing along the dirt road. A letter from the War Department for the Turner family, and Caleb read it slowly, lips barely moving, then folded it in silence. And Lilat watched from a distance and felt that something was wrong before she knew it, like a cold gust passing through the heat. And hours later, as the labor crew gathered tools to return to camp, Caleb approached and stopped a few feet away, still keeping the proper distance demanded by regulations, and said quietly, "My brother, you remember, I told you he served in Italy. He passed away. Wounds from the Apennines. The letter came today." And the words struck with the slow weight of a falling tree, and Lilat inhaled sharply and said, "I am so sorry." And Caleb nodded, jaw tightening, saying he was all I had left besides Ma. And silence followed, heavy and respectful. But the silence also carried another truth that Lilat recognized with painful clarity, because she understood loss intimately and completely. She had seen it in her father's burned shop, in the rubble of Munich, in the empty chairs at her mother's kitchen table. And she said, "I wish I could offer more, but I have only words." And he answered, "Your words are enough." And when the guard called out, "Load up, ladies," Caleb tipped his hat mechanically, but his eyes rested on Lilat for a moment longer than usual. And that night back at the barracks, she lay awake long after the other women slept, feeling a pull inside her, a mixture of sorrow, compassion, and something more dangerous, something she refused to name. And 2 days later, when the labor detail returned to the Turner ranch, the atmosphere had changed, and Martha Turner was sitting on the porch, her eyes red from crying, but her posture strong, nodding politely to the women and saying quietly, "Thank you for your help today." And the women curtsied instinctively, because respect feels universal in moments of mourning. And later, while working, a sudden cloud of dust appeared on the road, another army jeep rolling toward the ranch yard. A camp officer stepping out, clipboard in hand, to announce, "Repatriation orders, first transport leaves August 28th. All eligible POWs will begin pre-embarkation procedures next month." His tone brisk and official, the tone of a system rather than a human, and the women froze, exchanging glances of relief mixed with dread. Because to return home was to reunite with family or to return to ruins, and no one knew which, and no one dared hope too much. And Lilat felt the world shift under her feet. Because she would leave Texas and the ranch and Caleb, and she felt no joy in this, only confusion. And near the end of that day, while carrying supplies from the barn to the truck, she found Caleb waiting near the cattle gate, hands in his pockets, shoulders stiff with unspoken tension. And he said, "Word reached town, they're sending y'all home." And she replied, "Yes." And he asked, "Germany's broken, do you have anyone left there?" And she said softly, "A mother, if she survived the bombings." And he asked, "And your father?" And she hesitated and said, "Gone." And Caleb nodded slowly, as though confirming something he already suspected, and the wind shifted, warm and dry, smelling of cut hay. And he asked, "What do you want, Lilat?" A question careful and laden, and she said finally, "I don't know, Germany feels like a ghost, but I do not belong here." And he looked at her then, fully and openly, saying, "I don't know where you belong. But it doesn't feel right that you're being sent across an ocean to start from ashes." And she exhaled shakily, saying, "My life is not mine to choose." And he stepped back as though forcing himself to maintain distance, but said, "Just know you'd be welcome here, if choice ever comes." And before the guard shouted, "Load up," Caleb said one last thing, words she would carry into the night and into the weeks ahead. "There are fences in this world, but not all of them are meant to keep people apart." And back at the camp, rumors spread through the barracks. Because some prisoners had already married locals in other states after release, some had returned to America after repatriation, some had found sponsors who helped them come back legally. But such stories felt distant and impossible. Yet Lilat could not stop thinking of the way Caleb looked at her, not with pity, not as a prisoner, but as a woman with a future she was beginning to want more than she dared admit. And then on the night of August 26th, there was a commotion in the camp. A sudden arrival of officers, guards checking paperwork, baggage being inventoried, because the transport ship had been moved up and departure was now August 27th at dawn, and whispers filled the barracks. "They don't want trouble. They want us gone before any civilian attachments form." And Lilat felt her chest tighten as fate closed in. And at dawn on August 27th, the truck rolled toward the Turner ranch one final time, not for work, but to collect tools and sign off on completed tasks. and the sun was barely risen when Lilat stepped off the truck and Caleb was waiting. Having risen before dawn, standing tall and composed, but his eyes revealing the truth of how much he feared this moment. And she approached cautiously with the guard watching from the truck and said, "This is goodbye." And he replied, "It doesn't have to be." And she closed her eyes and a tear finally escaped, tracing down her cheek, and she whispered, "I cannot stay, not now. Not like this." And he nodded, his throat tightening, but said, "Promise me one thing when you reach Germany. If you find a way, if you want to come back, I'll sponsor you. I'll work the land harder than ever to make it possible." And she asked why. And his answer was simple. "Because you changed the way I see the world." And she inhaled sharply and said, "And you showed me that kindness still lives in it." And they stood in silence, the whole world shrinking to the space between them, until the guard called, "Time to go." And Caleb stepped back. And just before climbing aboard the truck, Lilat turned and lifted her hand slightly and spoke the last words he would hear from her for a very long time. "I will try to find a way back." And for weeks after the women of Camp Hearn were shipped home, the Turner Ranch felt strangely hollow, the cottonwood tree rustling the same way it always had. The wind sweeping across the pastures with its familiar dry whisper, the cattle bellowing at dusk. But there was an absence now, a quiet that had not existed before, and Caleb moved through his days repairing fences and tending the herd and hauling feed. Yet even Martha noticed the way his eyes lingered toward the road each morning, as if expecting a truck that would never come again. And on the evening of September 12th, Caleb sat alone beneath the cottonwood tree as dusk painted the fields amber, and he pulled a small folded leaf from his shirt pocket, the cottonwood leaf Lilat had picked up the day they spoke their parting words, which he kept pressed inside his Bible between the pages of Exodus, and he whispered into the quiet, "Did you make it back? Did you find your mother?" While in the ruins of Munich, Lilat arrived on a cold gray morning in late September, stepping off the transport ship among thousands of returning POWs. And Munich was unrecognizable, blocks of stone lying like broken bones, streets vanished into cratered scars, buildings leaning like charred skeletons, smoke still lingering in some quarters as the ghosts of fires long extinguished. And she breathed the air of home and found it tasted of dust and endings, and she spent weeks searching from one refugee center to another, following fragments of information and rumors and names scribbled on handwritten lists pinned to church doors. And on the 73rd day, she found her mother, thinner, hair streaked with silver, eyes weary but alive, and they embraced with a mixture of relief and grief. And her mother asked the question all mothers ask returning daughters, "Did anyone hurt you?" And Lilat answered truthfully, "No, in Texas they treated us with dignity." And late one night, by the weak light of an oil lamp, she unfolded a sheet of writing paper and began the letter she had been composing in her mind for months. "Dear Caleb, I hope this reaches the Turner Ranch, if it still stands," describing the ruins of Munich and her search for her mother and the colder world she had returned to. And at the bottom she wrote, "I do not know what the future holds, but I want you to know that I meant what I said. I will try to find a way back." And she folded it carefully and walked it to a post station, running on borrowed power and sheer human will, knowing many such letters never made it across the ocean, but sending it anyway, because war teaches people not to expect miracles, yet sometimes one arrives anyway. And on a warm afternoon in January 1946, Caleb trudged up the ranch road with a sack of feed over his shoulder when Martha called from the porch, "Caleb, there's a letter for you." And when he saw the postmark reading München, U.S. Zone, Germany, his heart jolted, and he took the envelope from his mother with shaking hands and sat down on the porch steps in the winter sun and read every line twice, a slow smile forming one his mother had not seen since before his brother's death. And Martha watched quietly from behind the screen door and asked gently, "Is it her?" And he said, "Yes." And she asked, "Is she all right?" And he answered, "She's alive, and she wants to come back." And his mother stepped onto the porch and laid a hand on his shoulder and said, "Then we'll help her," meaning every word of it. And in the spring of 1946, Caleb filed sponsorship papers. The process slow because nothing in a post-war world moved quickly, and there were interviews and affidavits and waiting lists, and months passed with letters traveling back and forth, sometimes taking 6 weeks each way, yet the thread between them remained unbroken, her handwriting becoming a lifeline and his replies becoming a bridge between continents. And by the time The U.S. government eased immigration restrictions in 1947. Lilat had saved enough working in post-war reconstruction to afford the journey, and her sponsorship was approved, and she arrived in Texas that autumn, one civilian among many seeking new beginnings, stepping off a train not as a prisoner, but as a woman choosing her future. And historians would later note that the phenomenon repeated itself across the country, former POWs returning not as prisoners, but as spouses and farmhands and neighbors, and Americans because war had brought them unwillingly while peace brought them back by choice. And for Caleb and Lilat, it was never about politics or cultural shifts, but about a single moment beneath a cottonwood tree and a decision made in the tension between hope and uncertainty. And by the time the 1950s settled over central Texas, the dust of war had long since blown across the plains and faded into memory. New highways cutting across old ranchland, electric lights spreading across towns that once went dark after sunset, children playing where training camps and barbed wire fences had stood less than a decade earlier. And most people who drove the rural roads near her never knew that thousands of prisoners had once lived behind those fences because the land had healed quickly, swallowing the past in tall grass and shifting soil, and what remained were only fragment stories tucked into local memory. Photographs fading in shoe boxes, a few surviving barracks on distant farms used now to store tools or hay, but some stories endured because they did not belong to nations, they belonged to people. And one of those stories lived quietly in the Turner Ranch house just outside Hearne, where Lilat Weber, no longer a prisoner, no longer a refugee, sat on the porch on summer evenings with her hands folded in her lap, watching the red sun sink behind the mesquite trees, and beside her sat Caleb Turner, older and stronger, and still carrying the calm steadiness that had first drawn her toward him beneath the cottonwood tree years earlier. And sometimes at dusk, when the heat softened and the first stars appeared, Lilat would think of Camp Hearne as it had been, the barracks washed in moonlight, the smell of dust and laundry soap, women whispering to one another about home, the guarded hope that tomorrow might bring something kinder than the day before, and she remembered the fear of not belonging in any world. Too German for America, too changed for Germany, a woman, suspended between two homelands shattered in different ways. And Caleb sensed these thoughts with the intuitive calm of someone who had waited a long time to understand another person's silence. And he would simply rest his hand over hers and say, "You're home now. Whatever came before, it brought you here." And she believed him. Because for Lilat, the war did not end in 1945, but ended slowly in letters sent across oceans and paperwork filled out in cramped offices and nights spent dreaming of ruins and cotton fields and the long walk back into herself. And when she became a naturalized U.S. citizen in the early 1950s, she took Caleb's surname Turner, but kept her first name, telling him with a small smile, "America can have my future, but my mother gave me my name." And they hung a single photograph on the living room wall, Lilat and her mother, taken during a final visit to Germany in 1952, standing together in a Munich courtyard rebuilt from ashes because her mother had grown stronger and found work as a seamstress in a city that rose slowly from dust and rubble. And though she never immigrated to America, she lived long enough to see her daughter's new life take root, and told her, "Go where the world is growing, I will stay where the world must be repaired." And neighbors noticed Lilat's accent, but treated her with the warmth that life in Texas seemed to cultivate naturally. And in time, the accent softened like stones polished by running water. And when she spoke English with a German cadence, children on the ranch listened with wonder rather than suspicion, and her past became a story to share rather than a wound to hide. And the old cottonwood tree on the edge of the Turner Ranch still stands today, its branches stretching wide and catching the Texas wind like an old ship's sails, its leaves scattering across the yard each autumn, its shadow falling in the exact place where Lilat once stood, deciding whether her life would return across the ocean or begin anew in this foreign land. And sometimes when the breeze rustles its leaves, Lilat listens with a stillness forged in the hardest years of her youth, hearing in that sound an echo of that afternoon in 1945, the moment when she understood that captivity does not end at the lifting of barbed wire, but ends when trust replaces fear. And what this story means in the vast machinery of global conflict where nations collide and histories fracture is that the smallest acts, offering water, sharing shade, speaking gently, become the brightest lights in the dark. and that sometimes those lights guide a person across oceans and across borders and across the boundaries others draw between us and them. And that a war brought Lilet Weber and Caleb Turner together while humanity kept them there. And their story ends not with war, but with peace, not with loss, but with love, not with the barbed wire that once separated them, but with an open porch where they spent the rest of their lives watching the Texas horizon, knowing they had built a home not from victory or defeat, but from compassion. Because sometimes the world that divides nations cannot stop the quiet, stubborn human urge to connect, and sometimes kindness shown in a cotton field under the Texas sun can alter the course of two lives and prove that even in the wreckage of the worst war the world has ever known, the story does not have to end in ruins. Sometimes it ends with the sound of a screen door opening on a Texas ranch, a woman stepping out into the sunlight, and a man who once met her as a prisoner welcoming her as the future he had always hoped for. And that is the hidden story history tried to forget, not the battles, not the treaties, not the maps redrawn in blood, but the quiet, stubborn, impossible love stories that grew in the spaces between enemy lines, in cotton fields and cattle yards and simple wooden porches, where two people from opposite sides of the world looked at each other and chose, against every rule and regulation and border ever drawn, to simply be human.